Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated will be filming, recording, and photographing this event for use in Delta promotional videos, photography, advertisements, social media platforms, web pages, and other future Delta events as the case may be. Via continued participation in and by continuing to remain logged into this event, hereby acknowledges that participant may be photographed, filmed, or otherwise recorded while on the premises of the event. Grants Delta, its successors, assigns, and licensees irrevocable consent to include participants' name, likeness, photographic image, mannerisms, and voice or other recording in the production or for exploitation for any purpose whatsoever in any and all media now known or hereafter devised throughout the universe in perpetuity without compensation and or credit. Represents, warrants, and agrees that Delta holds and shall forever hold all display, publication, and ownership rights, licenses, and privileges to any and all media, whether in law or in equity, which may be ascertained, registered, or in any way utilized with respect thereto, and waives, releases, and transfer, as the case may be, any and all such rights, whether in law or equity, as may be necessary or required to effectuate Delta's establishment of ownership. Participant further agrees to abide by and comply with any and all terms of use and or additional participation rules as applicable and specified during relevant sections of the program, and acknowledges, understands, and agrees that violation of such participation rules shall result in legal recourse and disciplinary action.
Well, good evening. I'm going to share my screen. So we're going to talk about Our Children Are Not All Right, protecting our legacy and guarding our children's mental health. And this is really a timely subject because, and I'm going to highlight this throughout the presentation, because there were a lot of studies that were done that look at children and what happened during the pandemic. And I think you're going to find some of the information pretty interesting, but also sobering and a little bit alarming. I love this quote in the work that I do around adverse childhood experiences and trauma. I came across this quote, and it informs the work that I do, not only as a practitioner, but also as a counselor educator. It says, Frederick Douglass, I think, noted this well: it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And I think if you looked at the span, and if we look at our families, if you ever looked at things that are happening in the world right now, you see that it's really hard looking at adults who are broken and trying to work to get them back together. So I'm going to let you listen for a minute to some young people talk about this whole issue around mental health.
Depression, and anxiety, and also just, feeling like I'm not good enough, feeling like people aren't going to accept me for, what I am.
Sadness, stress, depression, anger.
Being anxious, anxiety, fear, anger, and frustration.
Anxiety and embarrassment are the top of the list of very intense emotions that I deal with.
Well, I had anger and heartbreak were the main ones.
Being insecure about myself, like the way I look and like my body size.
Like I usually just like keep to myself, kind of. I'm not really like joking around or anything like that.
I feel sick to my stomach and as if nothing can go right.
I feel like just like alone, and I feel like nobody can understand what I'm going through.
It just kind of feels like I'm like this twig that's a walking twig that just goes anywhere and everywhere.
It's just like emptiness, like a gap, like kind of just like is gone away from my body or so.
You just want to scream, and it's like your life is all one big puzzle.
I get shaky and my stomach gets sick and my mind is jumping to the worst case scenarios and it's all over the place, jumping to conclusions.
My mind kind of like clamps together in a way, and I can't like pick out each and every thought that I can because it just swirls around and I can't like grab it and trying to work through it.
My heart is racing. I can't speak really clearly. I'm like kind of sweaty and just kind of not looking too great.
I like just get really paranoid and don't know what to do.
Sometimes it's like I get like this knot in my throat because I know that what I'm feeling, I can't express it or you can't say it.
I want to punch everything around me. Like I want to punch a wall, a bed, and
When I take pictures of myself, I kind of use a black and white filter to tell me that everything will look the same and nothing will change.
Take some deep breaths and listen to music, and talking to someone about it usually helps.
I listen to music, often music that either has to do with the things that I'm feeling or music that will make me feel the opposite of what I'm feeling. And I tell myself that whatever I'm feeling or going through, it's all going to get better and that it will end eventually.
I try to just think positive, have positive thoughts, and say I can get through it. Or I just try to just breathe and just relax.
I usually like write a poem, or like I'll try to figure out some kind of jazz chords to play on my piano to like mellow my mood a little bit. So
I try to remind myself that I'm not the only one who feels this way. I try to cool myself down to make everything go away.
So that gives you a snapshot of how children feel. That was just a group of children from a school area that they talk about what it's like to suffer with anxiety and depression. And so we're going to look at some data and give some face to numbers about what they talked about. Earlier, I talked about the research, sounding the alarm. You'll see all, I've taken these images and put here to show you just how many studies have been done and how much discussion has been going on, especially since the pandemic. Now, let's don't think for a second that children did not have mental health issues prior to the pandemic. It was pretty significant. But what they learned from this was from the pandemic in the 2.5, maybe 3 years that we were really in the throes of it, that it had a profound impact on children. And so they, when we start talking about school disruption and all those things, we started to talk about what happens when kids come back together. They've been isolated and been in situations and some not so safe, and what happens with them. Why is this a big deal when we talk about children's mental health, and why this month that we even look at it? Well, one of the things that's real clear to us is this, that mental health, if you know anything about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that was done between 1995 and 1997, it looked at the experiences that participants had as young children, looked at child abuse and neglect. It looked at, things that were going on in the home, asked, if you live with parents who suffered with mental illness, if you looked at where there was a socioeconomic issue with going on in the house. And they took this study with over 15,000 participants. They ended up with the data of 9. And they were able to link the adverse childhood experiences that happened to these people to other poor health outcomes for them later in life, in their adult life. That, if you have not read that study, let me encourage you to look at it. It's the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. When we started, the research group that I am with, when we started on this journey of looking at trauma in children and preparing school counselors and clinical mental health counseling candidate students at Trinity, we infused trauma-informed and trauma-responsive work throughout all our courses, because what we knew was that when they got into the field, they needed to know this then and not learn it later. And so we engaged in learning about this research before we did this. And it was just remarkable, the stuff that we learned around this with children. So I encourage you to go look at that study. So let's move on to the data. We know that mental health issues have increased. There was an increase in depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation among children. We're going to talk about where this happened mostly at. And so from the slides, I want you to just take a cursory look at some of the things. So this is what the data is showing. When you start to look at substance use, they looked at the COVID-19 pandemic, and they looked at the increased risk factors. And in substance abuse, they found that 1 of 3 high school students subjected themselves more to substance abuse during that time period than any other time. And so when you look at some of the mental health and the suicidality here, they looked at 1 in 3 of the students that had poor mental health during that time, looked at the attempts that they made. And so 2 out of every 5 students who felt emotional distress said that 1 out of 10 of them attempted suicide during that time period in the year. When you looked at disruption and adversity, and when you're talking about that, they're talking about things that were not only happening in school where they had difficulty completing their schoolwork. When they looked at these high school students, this is what they call the adolescent behavior experiences survey. And they did this national study, and this is what it is during the COVID-19. And so the data that you're looking at here is from that. This is the national data. When we get through this, you're going to look more specifically at Fairfax, because they did a youth survey that captured some of the same information. And so everyday life sort of got harder for them. 2 out of 3 of the students reported having difficulty with their schoolwork. 1 of 4 said they experienced hunger in their home. This was a disruption and adversity to them. And then 1 in 4 students, their parents experienced job loss. And what was more concerning to school counselors, my colleagues, we are on the Facebook community, they thought about their students that they knew who were already in abusive situations. And so 1 out of every 10 students experienced some physical abuse by a parent during the pandemic. And that was something that was real concerning to people who in schools who already knew that before we went to lockdown and before students had to go home. That was one of the things that school counselors talked about. They worried about their kids being at home because school was the safe space for them at that particular time. One of the things, there were a lot of disparities. We talked about health disparities. Well, guess what? There were disparities even when we looked at this in mental health of kids and what was happening to them. Now, the pandemic happened to all kids. It just didn't happen to them equally. And so that meant some things were going on with them. And what you see here is that hunger and physical abuse happen at a higher rate among LGBTQ students. American Indian and Alaska Native students had a higher rate of substance abuse. There was a larger amount of poor mental health among LGBTQ students than heterosexual students. There were more attempted suicides, at least 5 times higher among lesbian, gay, and bisexual students than anybody else. And we, if you looked at the news when everything happened with George Floyd during that time, one of the things that they began to do around the country is to identify racism as a national mental health, as a mental health crisis. And so kids, when they were asked that question about racism, it was more common among Asian, Black, and multiracial students than anybody else. And so this slide sort of tells you that more than, when you looked at it across the country, a third of all the high school students felt that they'd been treated unfairly at school and had had some experience, adverse experience with racism. And so one of the other studies that was done by the US Surgeon General, now there was a study that was done by the CDC. And so now the US Surgeon General did a study because they started to look at also at what was happening. And their study is called Protecting Youth Mental Health. And so some of the key takeaways from that was that it was an essential part, that we know it is an essential part of the overall health of young people, because we know that whatever happens to them now in the body has long-term effects for them as an adult. And so we also knew that COVID-19 added to whatever pre-existing challenges that they may have faced. If they were already facing anxiety and depression, COVID-19, with all the other things that were happening around the country during the time of the pandemic, the racial reckoning, all the political, positioning that was happening, that didn't help young people's mental health at all because of the things that they were already experiencing. And so it also shaped by a number of combination of factors, which we're going to talk about in our next slide. And so there was a focus on mental health, and the alarm that went out is that it was at a critical point at this right now, and that we needed to do something as parents in the school and as a community to address what was happening with young people. And so when you talk about those factors that I mentioned earlier with young people, they happen in the 4 domains of which you will find young people where they live. In our society, when we talk about the inequities, discrimination, racism, in the environment where you talk about neighborhood safety, food insecurity, those kinds of things, and the community, their relationship with teachers, mentors, and things that are happening with them in school, family, the relationship with parents, abuse that may be going on, family members who they may live with who may be having mental health challenges of their own, domestic violence, all that kind of trauma. And then of course, looking at them individually, where their age, any genetics, race, the ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation, disabilities that they may be experiencing, all of these help to shape the mental health of young people. So now because this is our service area, our chapter service area, let's sort of explore what's in our backyard. What's happening with young people in our backyard. We're going to go through some slides and sort of get a cursory view of what happened during that same period of time of the pandemic. This is some of that same adolescent behavior and experiences data that Fairfax County collected when they did their youth survey. It was administered in 2019, and then they published it in November. And as you can see from there, they looked at mental health and suicide in Fairfax. There was a 4% increase in the depressive symptoms. 30% of their students reported that they were suffering with depression. 14% reported considering that they considered suicide, and 6% of the students attempted that. Sobering for me anyway, as a person who's worked with youth, most of my career. 38% of females reported depressive symptoms in students. 36 reported having high levels of stress. And so I'm going to talk about it later when we talk about what we can do. But Fairfax County created this whole initiative, 3 to Succeed, and they talk about protective factors. And so when they did their survey and they took this data, they looked at what is it that we need to do to help children move to a place of better well-being. And then I'll talk about those factors later. So this is the report that I'm talking about. And so we're going to sort of run through the data. And I want you to just sort of take it all in. And, you know, it's almost like if I was doing a mindfulness exercise, I'd tell you to close your eyes, but I want you to see. But I want you to sort of take all of this in and understand, well, I have a passion about this in mental health among young people, because it was disturbing for me to sort of look at the same kind of thing. And so we're going to talk about the mental health during the pandemic among Fairfax County students here. This is the report that they were done. And so I'm going to run through some of the key findings real quickly, and then we're going to look at some of the graphic slides that's going to give you a little bit more information. One of the things that came from this is the rates of reporting the feeling of sadness, hopelessness, suicide thoughts, and attempts. It increased among the students in Fairfax County, and that followed the national trends that we were talking about earlier from the report that was done. They said that more than 38% of the students in 8th, 10th, and 12th grade had reported feeling bad or hopeless for 2 or more weeks in a row. And so 17% of those reported suicidal thoughts, and some 6% looked at made attempts. Female students were more likely to express high stress, persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. And they also considered it was high among them for attempts of suicide, and even considering it compared to male students. And let me just linger here for a minute. And I want to share something with you about this when talking about students, females. I don't know if you are familiar, but there was a report, and it was on television. And because we work with young women in our chapter and in our programs, you will find this is really important. This is national data. And I just think that it's important enough for me to sort of run through it real quick and talk to you about it. In the report that they did. And so bear with me, I'm gonna give you a couple of statistics. In the data that was done, and this was in that data from 2017 to 2021, and they looked at among teen girls, they had the highest levels of sexual violence, sadness, and hopelessness that they've ever reported when they started doing this yearly data and looking at youth behavior. Almost 1 in 5 teen girls experienced sexual violence in the past year, and that was an increase from 2017. So they're talking about, you know, when we do a collection of data, when they do these national studies, they're always like maybe a year or 2 years behind in their collection of it. And so 2021 is not that far out the door, but when you look at it from 2017 to 2021, when they collected this, you're talking about that number of girls. Keep in mind, in those years span, we were in the middle of a pandemic, which tell you there was a lot of abuse going on in homes and in other places. More than 1 in 10 teen girls reported they had ever been forced to have sex. And this measure increased for the first time since the CDC began monitoring this. So that is significant to note. 3 in 5 girls felt persistently sad or hopeless, a marker for depressive symptoms in 2021. And that was a substantial increase from what was happening in 2011. More than 1 in 4 girls reported they seriously considered attempting suicide in 2021. And that was up significantly from what was happening in 2011. And more than 1 in 10 girls reported they attempted suicide in 2021, increasing significantly over the decade. And also it's important to note that their alcohol use was much higher during this time than it was for boys. Significant things. Just wanted to share that little bit of information with you. I thought, you know, sort of let that marinate with you, especially when it comes to girls, which is why my research focus just got elevated when you talk about these statistics. Students of Hispanic ethnicity and students of color, we talked about earlier about the impact of racism. and which caused them to feel more feelings of persistent sadness or hopelessness, and considering suicide and even making attempts. Again, students identifying as transgender, gay, lesbian, bisexual, again, same thing, increase in the levels, rates in their stress, feelings of hopelessness, thinking of suicide, and even suicide attempts as well. Food, you would think that food insecurity would, we hear it all the time, we don't think much about it, but when they did the survey with kids, guess what? It was impactful to them. Again, raising the stakes around feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and suicidal thoughts and attempts. So now let's journey through the data here that you see on the screen and look at these graphic representations of some of the stuff that I gave you just a few minutes ago about some of the statistics in Fairfax. Everything that you will see at this point is specific to Fairfax County. And so as you can see, when you look at this and this is when they look at the health challenges in the year 2021, and they looked at this between 10th and 12th graders. And you will see while they had consistently lower rates, in 2021, the rates were the highest that they had ever been in 10 years among youth who were reporting in this study. You look at the US rate versus Fairfax, and we were in line with what was happening around the country, pretty much. When you look at the 8th and the 10th graders and persistent sadness, you will see it rose in 2010, in 2021. So this is their mental health concerns emerging here. Persistent sadness, and this is the one that sort of grabs you. This is 6th grade. The information we were looking at earlier was 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. Look at this graphic presentation of when you talk about sadness and hopelessness among 6th graders. 6th graders are usually tied to elementary, maybe in the beginning of middle school. Pretty significant information there. When you look at suicidal behaviors in Fairfax, you look at those who considered and those attempted, you will see that there's a slight increase among students. Those who attempted, it went up. And then when you look at those who were considering it, it was pretty significant. Of the 7th and 8th grade students that they looked at, they reported like 7.2% of them compared to 5% of the 12th graders. And so what they're saying is that even in middle school, you had this concern of students because they were experiencing the pandemic so profoundly that they were having these suicidal ideations. And so when you look at it by gender, you capture an even bigger view. Remember, I mentioned that females students reported significantly higher rates of feeling persistently sad and hopelessness. And so this graphic gives you an idea, and you will see across here, it's high in all these areas for females in terms of what was happening around their mental health challenges. When you take it by race, when you look at students who have multiple races, they tend to have had higher rates of those same feelings of hopelessness. And of course, when you're looking at considering suicide and attempts, it was pretty significant. It was high among Hispanic students. And when you look at Black students, it was down less for Black students, but there was an increase as they looked at, because when you look at national data, they even talk about the increase amongst suicidal thoughts and what they call carry through or execution among students of color. When you look at transgender versus non-transgender students, off the charts in terms of the hopelessness and those who are considering or attempted suicide. Just staggering percentages of kids who were having some major mental health challenges during that time. One of the things, and when you look at the legislation that they're talking about right now around the whole thing about, you know, if a child tells someone at school, you need to tell their parents. And of course, parents have a right to know things about their children. But the one thing that we know in schools is this: not every household is a safe household for a child to disclose some information about themselves. I mean, if it was challenging for girls who became pregnant to tell their parents, and sometimes they were afraid to do that, can you imagine a child who is dealing with, you know, gender issues, trying to have that conversation at home with their parents? And so when this graphic sort of gives, tells a little bit of the story of why we have concerns about this whole thing and about the whole policies and legislation, because we are already dealing with children who have high rates of mental health challenges around this whole issue. When you look at sexual identity, same thing, kids, that same discussion about kids coming out and talking about, you know, where they are, how they feel. You will see here again, persistence of hopelessness very high among bisexual students, gay and lesbian students, and as compared to heterosexual students and where they are in terms of sexual identity. Food insecurity. I looked at this slide again. You know, we talk about this, and sometimes we talk about this as it relates to the District of Columbia. But guess what? We have the food insecurity in Fairfax County too, in case nobody knew that. And we do. And if you look at this graphic, it tells the story about that and about children who lived in those kinds of situations where they were food insecure, and the mental health challenge that it presented for those kids. Again, persistent sadness and hopelessness, very high among children. Stress most of the time because of this lack of food, considering suicide and even attempts when it came to food insecurity. Sad state of affairs for children. And so when we look at this graphic, it talks about the percentage of the students who felt stressed most of the time. It was 70% versus 20.9% that in the past month. And this was in 2021 when they talked to this group of students in Fairfax, when they did this among 10th, 8th, 10th, 12th graders. And even in this, 6th graders are not captured in the data that you're seeing now in terms of the graphs. The percent of overall emotional abuse by parents. This is where we talked about kids that were shut in with family members. And when school was probably their safest place to be, and when schools closed, 24% of the students said they suffered with emotional abuse versus 75.2%. 24% is still 24% too much. So when you look at it by emotional abuse by race and sexual identity, females tended to be exposed to that emotional abuse more than males. Multiple races seem to more than any other race of students. And of course, again, as you can see, kids dealing with gender identity issues, again, experience emotional abuse and suffered with that mental health challenge more than any other student identifying as bisexual or heterosexual. The percent of physical abuse that happened among kids, 8.1% said they were physically abused. 91.9% of them said that they were not. When you look at it again, this graph tells the story, more females than males. From that, more Asian students. That was pretty much across the board in terms of students who experienced it. And so it was kids of color. And of course, again, kids who identified as transgender more than gay, lesbian, or bisexual young people. And so when you look at it, when you take that statistic and you look at Fairfax versus what was going on in the United States, it was pretty much sort of almost sort of the same for 12th graders, a little less for 10th graders, but it was happening. It was 11.9 in across the country in the United States, but 7.9 here in Fairfax County. When you look at their mental health challenge, looking at the physical abuse in terms of feeling hopelessness, and those young people as a result of that physical abuse, you'll see 71.3% said that they felt a persistent hopelessness from the physical abuse. Those who said no is in the green graph, and here 46.4 considered suicide and 23.2 attempted suicide because of physical abuse by a parent. When you, again, when we think back to George Floyd and all the things that were going on during the pandemic, there was a lot of racial and cultural things happening, not just with Black families, but Asian Americans, especially when it came to COVID. We unfortunately had a leader who sort of put the word out there and had people looking at Asian Americans in a very strange and dangerous kind of way. And so when they asked kids, of those race ethnicities, you'll see that 42.3% of the students said they received racial or cultural remarks, and 57.7 said they had not received. So while it was less reported of that did not, it was pretty significant of those who had. When you break that down by gender, staggering, females experience that more than males, just slightly. Back to that slide, slightly. Asian Americans and multiple races, you'll see across the board what we identify as people of color in those three categories, very high. And again, transgender, bisexual students, it was a little increase more than transgender and gay and lesbian, but nevertheless, it was high across the board for all of them. When you look at racist remarks that they experienced, persistent, when you talk about feeling persistent hopelessness, you'll see from this slide that it was pretty high, their hopelessness. Those who considered suicide, 23%, and those who attempted, it was pretty high, rather than those who did not. Forced sexual intercourse. This is things that happen to young people. It was low forced intercourse. What happened a lot with females. The reporting with that was that it was not as much, significant lower actually, overall in this category. When you, again, higher among females, more among Latina students. And of course, when you look at kids who in the transgender category, more than gay, lesbian, or bisexual, had forced sexual intercourse experience during that time period. When you look at sexual harassment of students, 15.8% said they were sexually harassed versus 84.2 that said they were not. And to put this in context, this study was done with over 7,000 students from 128 school districts. So when you are looking at these statistics, I want to give you that. So when you're looking at these numbers, well, this was done in Fairfax, but there were over 7,000 students that participated. When you look at harassment, again, females leading by gender in terms of experiencing sexual harassment, multiple races, it's pretty much, well, not the same numbers, but higher, just a little higher among other and multiple races. And if you look at transgender, just super high among, when you start talking about students who identify as transgender, gay, or bisexual, the LGBTQ community. Forced sexual intercourse, again, when you look at the Fairfax versus the United States, we did, I guess you know, it was high here, but it was higher than it's ever been in the time period when we talk about over the time period. So it is pretty significant when you talk about that, because it is pretty high. You know, when you look at it here, you say, well, that's not a lot. But when they looked at data before that, this is much higher than it had been in the last 10 years. The mental health, that when you look at hopelessness, when you look at these things and the impact that it has on students' well-being, persistent sadness or hopelessness, a high 74%, 48% consider suicide, and those who attempted. Sexual harassment, same thing, extremely high. Suicide high, and attempts as a result of the sexual harassment that they were had experienced within the school environment or during that time period. And so I've shown you all these statistics, and you said, okay, we've looked at a lot of data. So what does this mean? So if this matters, if children and young people's mental health and well-being matters to us, what do we need to do to improve these outcomes? And specifically, there's a lot of things. One of the things that the CDC talked about, and there's a whole list, if you have the opportunity to visit their site, they talk about a lot of things. One of the things that sort of surfaced and we got a lot of pushback from that we talked about was social emotional learning. And people wanted to tie that to critical race theory and parents. And it had nothing to do with that, but it had everything to do with helping kids get to this healthy well-being that we are talking about. And so connectedness is one of those things that we also, kids need to feel connected, not just in their house to the people they live with, but in the school and in the community. So Fairfax County came up with this 3 to Succeed. And they're saying that it takes at least three protective factors that will help kids to get to this place of well-being. So when they looked at it, they looked at what they call these assets. And one of these, when you look at these assets, they looked at school assets, and any of these things that could be done in the school system to help kids, you know, move to a place of good mental well-being. Of course, teachers, you know, high-fiving kids, telling them they're doing a good job, opportunities to talk to teachers, you know, it's sort of like that when you see something, say something. When you see kids that don't look like, you know, they're well, you know, physically, you're looking at them, they look withdrawn, you need to say something. And then, of course, having them feel safe, and then communicating with parents about their kids when they're not doing well. You know, it's not enough for the teacher to go down the hall and tell the school counselor, but it also helps when you call and say, you know, Johnny came to school today and he just didn't seem like himself. And I just wanted to let you know that, might want to just sort of take him out for an ice cream, have a talk with him and see what's on his mind. And that goes a long way with helping kids to be able to open up and to talk. And then they looked at what they call community assets. One of the things I'm thankful for our programs, because it's one of those things that you would talk about, Delta Gems, Delta Academy, and certainly our Embody program. When you talk about extracurricular activities or connecting them with the community kinds of organizations and activities. And the other thing, as much as we legalize marijuana, one of the things that they said, we need to say no to that for young people. One of the things that, and for all my medical people who are on the platform and they know this, the frontal lobe of a young person's brain is not fully developed until they're past like 25. So and this is where all the decision making and all those emotions and things are happening. And so if that's the case, and we are subjecting them to these substances, can you imagine what's happening up here in terms of that center where they're trying to make, good decisions, and it's impacted by that? And so having us disapprove those substance use among them, talking to adults in communities, mentoring programs, neighborhoods, noticing that their children are doing a good job. And then, of course, we have parents who have multiple responsibilities. And now that we're back in the office and we're working, we need parents who are available to help their young people, to know where they are. With their parents, and sometimes, yes, they don't know where their kids are. It's important you know where they are and what's happening with them. Parents need to do the same thing that communities and adults in the community, and that is disapprove the use of marijuana and other substance drugs. We know when they talked about vaping, that was such a huge problem for our kids, that schools started instituting policies against that, and with good reason. And so now we have the fentanyl problem. We've lost a lot of kids as a result of their fentanyl use, and it's not really going to stop. We're putting things in place in schools to try to curb that, but as long as they have access, it's going to be a problem for our young people. Family members respectful of each other, kids not watching their parents go at it and tearing heads apart and those kinds of things, and then letting them have some input in some of the family decisions. Sometimes we used to do this thing when grown-ups are talking, go sit down, but guess what? Sometimes you need to include them. It endears responsibility. It helps that growth. It's a growth edge and asset for them, for us to get them involved in those things. And then the individual assets, we talk about our children. We're not trying to tell parents to overburden themselves, but find some extracurricular activities for your child to be involved in. Coming home and sitting home in the house and in front of a TV or with the video game. And as much as we love Facebook and Twitter and all of that, they have a dark side to them. And it's a dark side for kids. And what part of the research that you can read about is the impact of social media on the social emotional well-being of children. And I can tell you the statistics on that is not very good. It has increased suicide attempts and the carry through of suicides among young people. Thinking through possible results before they make a decision, accepting responsibilities for the actions and mistakes, and then doing the best even when they don't like the jobs, like going to school and doing homework, but encouraging students to do their best anyway. So my final word is this. You remember in the beginning, we talked about Frederick Douglass, about building children rather than trying to repair old men. And so when we talk about why is this important and why does children's mental health matter? Well, it matters for a whole lot of reasons. One, because it is. Our children's mental health is priceless to us. If you have ever gone on a playground and watched children play and hear the laughter like there's no care in the world, that, hey, all is right with the world, that sort of endears with you that thought that it's priceless. It's when that smile goes away, when that glimmer and that light goes out of their eyes, when that voice becomes very low or to non-existent, that is when we have a problem. We need to worry about our children. And that's what we don't want to happen. We want them to have that life because we know that their mental health is priceless for us. So that's the final word for Diane Reese. Thank you for showing up on this platform. And I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah Washington, and she will give us some further directions of what we're going to do.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Sora Reese. I'm actually going to turn it over to Sora White for some Q&A.
Okay.
Hi, Sora, Dr. Reese. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
All right. So our first question is, why do you believe it is more challenging to now find a mental health practitioner since the pandemic?
It is more challenging because there are more people seeking mental health services. And I'm glad you asked that, because we are feverishly in the academy trying to train students for the mental health field and for school counseling. The other thing is, just like people sort of left their profession, there were people who just sort of they had stopped life, and that's in a lot of other places as well. But we noticed that we had an increase of people seeking mental health services. One of the things that we've always noted, people of color didn't always access, and especially Black and Hispanic people didn't always, because there was always this stigma around, mental health and seeing a counselor, seeing a therapist. Well, that's not the case anymore. We have sort of taught people and encouraged people, it's okay to seek help. As a matter of fact, I'll take you, we'll help you get help. And so with that increase of people now realizing I need to talk to someone, we just did not have enough. You would think for as many people that come in the field that you did. And so we don't. So what we're doing in the academy, not just in George Mason, but across the country, is our clinical mental health programs have had a significant increase of students in studying. And so we're really trying to make sure we have very well trained people to be able to meet the needs of people who are seeking mental health services.
Thank you for that. I mean, I know this list might be extensive at this time, but do you have any resources that you can possibly give us to direct people that may be seeking mental health practitioners?
Yes, there's a website, if you're Black Girl Therapy, there is a whole host of therapeutic places around. I can certainly put that list together and make sure it gets sent out. The Life Enrichment Center, they are based in Alexandria and also in Gainesville. Then I can rattle off a whole a number of them. Certainly a whole host of them. Yes, if you go to Psychology Today, you will find a therapist. You can go online and find a therapist there, depending on what you're looking for. There's also a group called the Center for Pastoral Counseling, for those who may be looking for a Christian-focused kind of counseling. And when I say that, I don't want people to misunderstand and say, okay, is that all they do? It is grounded in the same theory that we train our students in terms of theories of counseling. The focus is that they bring in the scriptural passage as clients desire, and integrate that in. There is what we call spirituality in counseling. That's a whole thing around counseling. As a matter of fact, there's a whole association of that. And so it gives people a wide berth of opportunities to engage in mental health counseling.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
So our next question is, so you talked a little bit about social media and the negative impact that it has on children and adolescents. Do you believe or do you know of any positive aspects that social media may have in regard to mental health for this particular age group?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And this is why it's important that, you know, parents are aware where their children are going as well, because there are positive things. I mean, social media is not that boogeyman, you know, in and by itself. It's also where kids can go and connect with, find their communities. Like kids in the LGBT community, they can find their community in social media, where it has supported them. And as a matter of fact, in a very good way as well. Social media where girls, teen girls, especially girls of color, have been able to find what they call their people, their community, based on whatever the issue might be, whatever they're looking for. And it works for young adults as well. The same thing that we do when we use social media to form our little groups and those kinds of things. But it is important that parents are aware as well of where their children are going, because it is those places that they go in, those dark places, and that's when it becomes that thing that's not so great for them. And when, you know, the other thing like Twitter, you know, when your girls go on to shame, body shame, to do a whole lot of things to other girls that drive them to do things, to make attempts and then to carry through. So it's not all bad, but it is cautionary. It is something that we should be very cautious about.
Thank you for that. So our next question is a two-part question. So we talked a lot about the stats on suicide. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you, what are some early signs of recognizing suicide, and how can we approach this conversation with our children?
Thank you for asking that. Some of the signs, you know, they're withdrawn. You know, you don't see them socializing. And kids, you know, especially during the pandemic, people said, well, they stayed in their room. And one of the things is when family is getting together, you don't always want your children in their room. A very quick story. I worked with a colleague some years ago, and she was home. Her husband and her two boys were home. And she and I mean, we were very closely together. And she, as a matter of fact, and she told me when she came back, her young son was in his room. And she said they were watching TV and they didn't think anything about it. And she said that she kept thinking, she said, he's been in his room. It never dawned on him that he was going through, he was being bullied at school. And he just never said anything. And when she went to his room, she found that he had tied a rope and hung himself in his room. And so, you know, that's the thing. You engage your children, as you know, in conversations. You know, check in with them. You know, how are things going? You know, when they said these one-word answers, oh, it's okay. You know, come on, have a conversation. Let's talk about some things that are going on. You know, and so when kids have that depressed look, withdrawn a lot, and so watching those kinds of things with kids, and you know, and the things that we have in our homes. One of the things we talked about is if you have any kind of medications that you know that can be consumed, you have weapons to lock them up, those kinds of things. And especially if you know your child suffers with depression or have depressive kinds of symptoms, and get them help. Don't be afraid to say, we're going to talk to somebody.
Thank you for that.
Mhm.
And then our last question is, so as we've all seen, the number of school shootings across the nation have increased significantly. What differences have you seen in children's mental health and how they are affected in school because of these school shootings?
Fear. I work with our research team in the District of Columbia, and one of the school counselors that we train in, we did some training around trauma-informed expressive arts. And so we mentor her. And one of the things that part of the mentoring of her is to follow what she's doing. And in her neighborhood over in Ward 7, in the middle school, they found a body outside her school. And the kids, they don't even let them go outside. But what the thing that she noticed is there's a lot of anxiousness, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear. But it's also when kids can't go out and play or just get out and breathe, you start to get a lot of behavioral problems with kids in school because they have nowhere to let out that anxiety except in the space that they're in. And so you start to see a lot of those things. So the impact of the shootings do have a profound, and not just where it's happening in the district. It's what kids might even see on TV that they may even think, could it happen to me? And when they look at, especially when it happens in their school. And so, you have those things where you have kids that they live in fear.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for answering all of our questions, Dr. Reese. I'm going to turn it over to Soror Dr. Washington so that she can also close out the session.
Okay. So on behalf of the Health Initiatives Committee and our president, Helene Fisher, I'd like to thank you first, Soror Reese, for your presentation on children and mental health. I've learned a lot from your presentation, and I'm also shocked, but also empowered by the data that you've presented today. We'd like to thank everyone who attended this event this evening. If you have any questions or concerns, or would like to know more about our chapter and programming, please go to fcacdst.org. Thank you and good night.